in the year 2014, September, was the culmination of 3 years of a campaign to get Scottish independence from its union from England. Sadly, it failed. These politicians and the whole media establishment in the UK fought and tried to stop it, and they were eventually successful. Their whole message was that Scotland, as a people, is totally unique on this planet, as we were the only people that were incapable of managing and looking after ourselves. They also gave over 240 broken promises. But this talk is not about the independence campaign. This talk is about a phrase used during that campaign. Part of the campaign, we were love-bombed by celebrities and some politicians, and they said it was a voluntary union on many occasions and have done since 2014. So I wondered, is it a voluntary union or was it not? There's so many myths and lies within the political structures of the United Kingdom that I wondered. So here is what I found out. The Union of the United Kingdom had Ireland, which fought a short war and got its freedom in 1921 from the Union, leaving this rump in 1921. Wales was assimilated in 1535, Scotland 1707. Wales lost due to basically many years of conflict, but Scotland lost because of deceit. Basically, the Saltire of Scotland on the top here merged politically with the George Cross below to form the Union Jack as it was in 1707. Many see a red cross on it, but that wasn't until Ireland became part of the Union. So this talk is about Scotland's involuntary union. And it's going to talk about the years just prior to 1707. The talk has 3 sections, a bit of background, and then history as told by the United Kingdom's London-centric historical viewpoint and history, and then finally in my conclusions I put a different spin on it based on what you actually see and the contradictions that are there. So first of all, a bit of background to the situation in the country of Scotland prior to 1707. During the Middle Ages in Northern Europe, Northwestern Europe, there was a mini ice age up here between about 1350 and possibly 1870, when the temperature dropped by a good 1.5 degrees compared with the norm. Of course, it wasn't linear like here, it went like this, and there were some periods when it was worse. But this period here, that was pretty level, even temperature, went back well before the Roman time, over 2,000 years ago. And even today, the temperature today is only marginally different from 2,000 years ago. It's a decimal point difference. Scotland, unlike many parts, with the exception of Scandinavia in Europe, was very hilly and mountainous and didn't have much flat land for agriculture, especially based on the techniques and practices done in Scotland at that time. So famine and war played a big part in this story. There were 7 years of bad famine in the 1690s. It is estimated during that time that between 5 and 15% of the Scottish population died of starvation, and it was particularly bad in the northeast of Scotland, in the Aberdeenshire area and along the northeast coast. There was also relatively bad harvests after this, but these were the 4 years when the harvest totally failed, although there was partial failures here. During the same time, there was a war in Europe between Spain and the Netherlands. England got involved, France got involved, and there was blockades along the coast with Europe, which affected trade because lots of Scottish trade went to Northern Europe. That decade, the 1690s, based on tree ring data, was the coldest in Scotland for 750 years. Also at that time beforehand, Scotland, because of its geography, had difficult terrain, poor roads, poor methods of transport. There was little trade between different parts of Scotland other than in the centre belt. This improved from 1660 when lots of towns started to have markets. Markets caused people to move to make money, sell goods, so trade increased. Despite these gloomy things I've been saying, economically Scotland had a surplus and it still exported food, particularly to England, but also to Northern Europe. There was a lucrative trade of cattle in particular to England via ship, and long drove lines that went down as far as Manchester from Scotland, taking the cattle in long droves, a bit like the American West with the cowboys. But Scottish agriculture efficiency was poor, and it didn't really improve until about 1750. Part of this improvement was caused by the Union and more different methods coming forward, but also because we suddenly got good roads due to its military occupation from 1745. There was also the desire of England from the 1100s to have Scotland under its wing, and there was regular conflict and small skirmishes along the border and in a more official way sometimes between the two countries. What started the rot really, in a mild way, was in 1603 King James VI of Scotland became also James I of England. So you ended up with a singular monarch, taking two oaths to two countries, to two constitutions. Unfortunately, as soon as he went down the road to London, he totally ignored Scotland, as did all the people after him, although up until 1707 all monarchs did swear both oaths. So now I'm going to tell you the story as per the history books, and you'll notice that there's a bit of error and contradiction in it, but that's what the history books say. The story is about an area of what is now the country of Panama called Darien, where the land is narrow between the Pacific Ocean and the Caribbean Sea. So what's leading to it? As I mentioned, there was conflict between Scotland and England for many years. The Scottish Royal Navy defeated an English mini-blockade at Leith and Dundee in the years 89 and 90, and that was in the embryonic Royal Navy. But despite this, because of the Union of the Crowns, the Scottish Navy from 1620 fought Spain and France and went after privateers, which are pirates, and within the North Sea and the Irish Sea. Scotland didn't have long distance ships capable in a regular way of protecting ships going to the other side of the Atlantic. We were more European. We lost our colony partly because of that, our first colony, but it was actually England's war and the Dutch and France, who were in the region of Nova Scotia at the time, that caused us to lose it. But the real change for the future, heading towards the Union, was that in 1651, despite the fact that Scotland with its Royal Navy here tried to actually work with England to help it, the actual England ignored Scotland after that because of greed. It saw India and the North American continent as its own realm, so it stopped navigation by France, Spain, the Netherlands and Scotland. It militarily stopped trade between these areas and its colonies. The idea behind the Darien expedition that Scotland did was just simply for trade reasons, to help to improve trade in the country. The architect of the scheme was a Scot from Dumfries area who had been down at London some time and had spent some time in the Bahamas, and he had proposed to England about doing a colony over the Isthmus of Panama. They said no. He tried to get Holland interested. They said no. He tried to get the remnants of the Holy Roman Empire interested. It said no. But it came to Scotland and had a receptive ear. But one man coming up with the idea won't actually make much progress, and then there's people in Scotland at that time keen to back it up, mainly the wealthy and the privileged. So this caused in 1695 the Bank of Scotland to be created, and a company called the Company of Scotland was born. Its plan was to get half its money, 300,000, from Scotland, from private investment, and the rest from England and Europe. But the colony of Darien was on Spanish land. Also, the East India Company threatened legal action to Scots because it said they had no authority from the king. They, of course, were thinking the King of England, who was actually still and actually was the King of Scotland, William, to raise funds outside England's realm. Right? So what they're saying is that the Scots couldn't go to areas that England deemed its land. So because of that, the English Parliament, backed up by the Crown, stopped all English investment in the Company of Scotland. This in turn meant that other parts of Europe withdrew their funds as well. Bear in mind that England knew that this plan was in hand. This, needless to say, the people in Scotland got a bit upset at the English Parliament's actions, which had been going on since 1651. And they thought, what? We are a separate country. What right has England to say we can't do it? So they raised money themselves. It was a fully private venture. The Scottish Treasury didn't fund it at all. But it was an enormous sum of money, about 20% of Scotland's private wealth. Eventually 5 ships, 2 brand new built in the Netherlands and big enough to protect in the open ocean, sailed from Leith round the north coast of Scotland to Madeira. They got into Madeira for water, and they arrived in New Caledonia in the area of which is today called Darien in November 1698. They started to clear the land for farming, but the seeds they took were not suited to that climate. They were suited to Northern Europe. There was very little locals because the land was so poor, so there was no local trade, and no fleets of merchant ships arrived to support the endeavour. The lack of trade was no accident to the colony, as the Crown and Parliament in England had stopped all its English colonies in America, the West Indies and England itself dealing in any way with the colony. There was no trade-to-trade coast set up. There was no history of trade across the Pacific Ocean at that time. And basically everything went downhill, and the settlers were decimated by shortages of food and disease. And eventually, near the end of the colony, 10 colonists a day were dying. So in July 1699, the colony was abandoned. The 300 remaining people on one ship tried to get food and water in Jamaica, but they wouldn't give it because of the dictates from London. But some of them survived. The ship got victuals and water in New York before it crossed back over to Scotland. And the people in Scotland, hearing the news, were so dismayed that even families disowned the returning, starving settlers. While this was going on, 1,300 other people in a second expedition sailed, and they arrived in 1699 to find the colony deserted. But this repaired the damage. New Spain was going to attack, so they did a preemptive strike against the Spanish local garrison. But eventually, due to disease and the same reasons as the first colony, they surrendered to Spain and left in April 1700. The failure of Darien caused tremendous discontent in Scotland. The Company of Scotland struggled on with 2 attempted colonies in Africa and 1 in the Far East. The one in the Far East actually worked for a couple of years, and then an East India Company ship went there and discovered that all the Scots had been killed. They blamed the Dutch East India Company. The East India Company sunk one ship of the Scottish fleet called the Speedy and captured the Annandale. This caused extreme anger in Scotland, and there was a call for war with England. But the crew that sunk the Speedy were captured and they were publicly hung in Edinburgh. In 1703, the new Queen, crowned the previous year, suddenly took an interest, in quotes, historically, about trade disruption caused by a war with Scotland. What trade disruption? All the trade disruption was caused by England, but the message was the trade disruption caused by Scotland, and if there was a war, possible death. So there was an endeavour publicly to unite the parliaments of Scotland and England. In Glasgow in 1703, this document submitted for consideration by the good people of England was asking for help because of the trouble Scotland was in because of Darien. I'll come back to this later. The Convention of the States, which were the sovereign people of Scotland through the different parts of the country, had been running the country since 1689, but in 1703 they made themselves MPs. And I wondered why. But the reason is you can't have a treaty between 2 countries unless 2 countries have an official government. So this was all manipulated somehow to happen because of what was going on. Article 14 of the treaty was a bribe to the nobles of Scotland. It was a payment of £398,000. They called it the equivalence because it was roughly what was used for the Darien expedition. And on paper, according to the blurb at the time, it was to help Scottish industries and help Scotland and the Darien investors. But most of the money was used to hire spies such as Daniel Defoe, who was famous in Scottish history, and to do bribery payments. Just before the Union, Defoe reported that 99 out of 100 Scots were totally against the treaty. It was being driven by the wealthy. Here's an example of the corruption. James Douglas, who lived in Glasgow, remember the document I told you earlier that was asking the people of England to help Scotland because of Darien. It came from Glasgow. He was the head honcho in Glasgow. But Scotland was governed from Edinburgh, and the Scottish civil service and leadership was in Edinburgh, so it's strange that the document asking for a bailout came from Glasgow. On the day of the treaty, the bells of St Giles played "Why Should I Be So Sad on My Wedding Day?" because everybody in the country, apart from a few, opposed the Union. In July 1706, there was 2 documents agreed for the abolition of the English Parliament and the Scottish Parliament, so that in May 1707, when the treaty happened, there was a new Parliament called the Parliament of Great Britain. Only 62% of Scotland's MPs voted for the treaty. They couldn't do it in the Parliament building. They had to run down the Royal Mile to a building on the left just before the palace to hide from the rioting mob while they signed the document and signed away hundreds of years of Scottish history and freedom. The equivalent bribery was never actually sent out to everybody that coughed up money for the Company of Scotland. It was kept by the wealthy in addition to the bribes. And the equivalence money was held, some of it, by 2 societies, one English. So although the money was for Scotland, it went to some people in England as well. And the 2 holders of the 2 societies merged and 1724 to form the Royal Bank of Scotland. So now I'm going to stop talking about Darien. But this is some things you might like to come back on the video slider. So here you have one of the two new ships that were built for the Royal Scottish Navy. There's the emblem of Scotland at the back, the Royal Coat of Arms with the people and the crown equal, with the Scottish flag at the top. This shows the routes. This is a detail of the harbour where everything was. The harbour was New Edinburgh in Panama, where it joins Colombia. The Panama Canal is here. So, before I give my point of view on all the weird things that you've heard, I want to give a Union view. When I was researching this, and if you read history, you'll see that the slant of the victor, as always in these cases in history, slants things and distorts things to give the view from the side that won the debate. They forgot to mention in this that since 1651 there had been barring trade with Scotland to all its colonies. It caused restrictions on trade to Europe. It banned all trade completely in 1701, so the cattle trade dried up, and this was at a time after famine. They stopped trade during the war, and they had a lack of knowledge in Scotland because all the historians forget to mention that it was the people that ran the country, and they allude that there was a parliament of MPs all the time. There was not. That only happened because of the work that was getting done to form the Union. I mentioned at the beginning about the Project Fear to do with a referendum for Scottish independence in 2014. Part of it, which started in 2012, a Professor Malcolm Chalmers did a talk well published in the media at the time, that if Scotland was independent, once again, we're the only country that can't defend itself or run itself, that this talked about the Scottish independence defence could be impossible without the strength of the United Kingdom. Bafflingly, during this, he talked about Darien, nothing to do with the topic, and he basically said that the Darien colony created the Act of Union, but only because business people thought the Royal Navy was key to good trade. Really? I'll come back to this in a second. The spy Daniel Defoe, when the treaty happened, publicly stated in London, they can have their 45 MPs so that they can sit in our parliament and it'll be laughed at. The truth is, even today, 2024, if you follow what goes on in politics, you'll know that that parliament still laughs at independents supporting members of parliament. At the time, the first Earl of Shaftesbury, he was made famous by integral creating this English Bill of Rights. He said, "The Scots, we have them now," before he justified what happened. As an aside, in the 1708 general election, we had 8% of the MPs in the GB Parliament. Now we have still 8.76%, so you could say that we're better represented now. In April 1706, these two gentlemen, which were commissioners involved in discussing treaty with the Treaty of Union, had a meeting minuted. Unfortunately for them, they were blowing their own trumpet, and here's a summary of those minutes. They both agreed that the famine of the 1690s was a good base for what happened to get the treaty accepted because it affected the finances of the wealthy. They laughed how easy it had been to completely destroy the Darien scheme. Think about what I said earlier and think about what happened. As commissioners starting to do the treaty negotiations from 1705, they were really happy with themselves that they were involved. And they reckoned they were going to try to make it so Scotland could never become a sovereign state again. The trouble was, it was a legal treaty in law, recognised today by the United Nations. And in that treaty and the integral claim of right, we can indeed leave. It's just that our politicians don't seem to want to at the moment in Scotland. Here's my personal view of that information you know through this talk. I'm putting my own slant on it. The coloured bits yellow are when I vary from the history. So I mentioned the background, the weather, the geography, the famine, war and economy caused chaos in Scotland in terms of not very happy, and the wealthy lost a bit of money. Despite a history of working together between the two navies, although it was two sovereign countries, and the loss of an early colony, it was the 1651 Act that started putting the brakes on Scotland's trade. In Darien, proposed by William Paterson, William was a Scot from near Dumfries, a place called Tynwald, and he'd been out as a 17-year-old for a while in the Bahamas, a very poor colony at that time, and he met a buccaneer who told him that Darien, which was a jungle on the borders between what is now Panama and Colombia in South America, you could put a road across and get trade between the two countries. Now, whether he personally believed it in this instance, but he did believe it because he tried to get England to do this several years before, and he also tried to get the Dutch and the remnants of the Holy Roman Empire to do it. Everybody refused, but he had a receptive ear in Scotland. Was that because some wealthy people were primed by it? Was he pushed by the English government to see if there was a chance of his dream coming full here? Maybe. I believe the dream for him, though, whatever happened to make him come here to Scotland and propose this, was real, because he went with his family, his wife and child, on the second expedition. His wife Emma and his child died. He was really ill, but he made it back. And when he came back, he became a supporter of the forming of the Treaty of the Union. Except he wrote a paper wanting the equal balance in Parliament between the two countries, which of course never happened. So the Company of Scotland was created, and despite this situation up here with the proposal that England knew about, they actually, after money was rolling in, they stopped the English people with putting money in, which affected other countries. So the Scots were left hanging. So they decided to do it themselves with 20% of private money. Spain was told this was going on, and all trade with Darien from England itself and from its colonies in America and the Caribbean was stopped. A strange thing in history is this. To make it look like in history that England didn't know about this, the ship sailed from Leith with all the settlers below decks round the north of Scotland to Madeira, and when they got to Madeira for food and water, the captain opened his orders, the settlers found out where they were going, and off they went to Darien. Really? What about this? What about the whole of Scotland knowing about what was happening and the money and so on? This is impossible, but that's history. So it was inbuilt failure, but they did try to continue with the Company of Scotland in the Far East and Africa. The monarch suddenly decided that she was worried about Scotland because they were so upset at the machinations here that they should have a war with Scotland. So she thought about starting a commission to make a treaty. And this was partly done because of this document that came here from Glasgow. The Parliament of Scotland administration was in Edinburgh. The equivalent payments never went to nearly anyone who had paid up money into the Company of Scotland. It went as bribes, and the payment for English spies, according to the history, they even admit that. And then people in England who had got some of this money and in Scotland eventually took their money out and formed the Royal Bank of Scotland. So we had a long time of monarch neglect, but the real reason it failed was malicious manoeuvring by the English government with help from the Spanish and by Scottish nobles, and for most a total ignorance about the area of Darien with regards to its suitability to a project. Hearing what I've been saying, do you think it was a voluntary union? Going back to the comment I made about from April 2012 by Malcolm Chalmers about how the nobles were happy to see the Royal Navy and make it help so we can get a colony and improve the country. But what actually happened was this, Mr. Chalmers. It wasn't a voluntary union. This is what happened. Robert Burns, who was a nationalist, wrote a song about what happened, and these two sentences here are taken from that song. Involuntary is something done against someone's will. I believe the nobles of Scotland, working with the English government, set this whole thing up because the economic situation in Scotland, including with the famine, made them worried and they were wanted a financial out. That's my personal opinion while I look at this history. Do some reading yourself, but when you do so, think, who wrote it? Scotland was not bankrupt. Yes, it was struggling because of the blockades, but the worst of the weather with hindsight was over. Scotland could have continued. Treachery and deceit caused it to lose. So that's the end of my talk. But what I'd like to end up by saying that if you want to know more about the treaties and various things about Scottish history, look at this website. And if you want to read about a different history from the conventional English-centric history, then read Doonharden, which is Scots for held down, written and published in 2020 by Professor Alvett Baird. This is a series of 5 videos on YouTube. The first 2 have been published, and if you search in YouTube with these names or this URL, you'll find them. So this is my 3rd video, and the 4th video here will come out in 2 or 3 months' time. I hope you found it interesting. Think about the steps. Think about what could have happened. Thank you.